seen some really odd things that some of these finance bros will say. I've seen guys say that the government owes money to the Fed. Like that's where a lot of their debt is. It's owed to the Fed for somehow. Like they're not just a branch of the government itself. People don't really understand jack shit. I've seen a lot of guys say things like crazy stuff like the US owes a ton of money to all these like global banks or something like that. A lot of that shit is not really true either. A lot of that stuff is like harebrained conspiracies. A lot of the debt itself, the US debt, it's actually owned by the citizens, like obviously in forms of treasuries and stuff like that. They have a few other instruments that they can use, but T-bills is obviously one part. And what happens too, it's not just the citizens. I would imagine a lot of the US debt, I'm just speculating, but obviously it makes the most sense. I haven't done all of my research on that, but I would imagine that most of it is actually owned by the US citizens, in different accounts and things like that, and funds and stuff like that. And that, you lock up your cash for a set amount of time, into the US, and they sort of push it into the system. It's one way to kind of lock up a lot of cash as well. So it's meant to slow inflation to a degree, and I guess it helps a tad. But the smart thing, and obviously the US debt, a lot of it will be owned by other countries as well. I imagine countries through Asia, UK probably has some, mostly those countries. I imagine Japan has a considerable amount of US debt. They're probably usually more conservative type investors, which their conservative nature has really hurt them lately because they don't really think they're speculative, like they're not as risky. So their economy has been really slow. They've missed a lot of sectors because they are more responsible, like pragmatic types. They don't really speculate as much. So it wouldn't surprise me if they own a lot of US debt. But yeah, as a rule, guys don't understand jack shit. So like I've said, countries or other people or things like that will take T-bills at 5%. Treasury bills, they get paid out 5% as they mature. And they don't understand that the inflation's at 8 to 10%. So the US is inflating its own debt away. They're paying back 5%, yes, but they're printing the presses and running the presses so that that's like the inflation's like 8 to 10%. So every year they make money. So a lot of people don't understand fuck all, about actually how the financial markets and like the debt instruments and things work. Guys think that like one central bank. I've even heard weird things like people think like the banks are giving the US, like funding the US government or something like that, which is quite odd. I'm sure banks through several like, intermediaries own considerable amount of treasuries, but that's like a little bit different. Guys will think like even a country owning a smaller or what would determine as a large amount of the treasuries, it's only like a small hedge of their position. They have to put their money somewhere. So a lot of guys I know, especially the older type investors, they used to believe in putting like 10% or even 20% into bonds and treasuries and things like that. They used to think that that was a pretty good play. I don't think that that's really a good play into the future or anymore. And guys will think, the US dollar is just going to collapse and all of this stuff's going to happen, but they don't understand like collapse against what. Like the US dollar is already collapsing against most assets, most assets that generate yield, or most assets like Bitcoin or gold or other things like that. The dollar is not really holding up to over the long term. Like that's pretty normal. But the very concept that the US dollar is going to collapse to like other currencies, I don't really understand that. I think the dollar milkshake is more likely to play out, and that it is actually playing out in real time. It's just more obvious into the emerging markets, like the emerging currencies and the smaller currencies. Like obviously they're getting crushed by the dollar. Because when the US lends people debt, like when the US lends out and things like that, a lot of the time they only take payment back in dollars, which means that the currency has to pay back dollars, which means they have to print more of their own currency to pay their US denominated debt. So they get fucked 10 times harder. So people don't really know shit. They only understand shit at such a fucking like just the veneer level. Because most of the finance suit guys don't know shit. Like they don't actually know shit either. They just parrot crap and talk garbage. They just stand there and talk about theory and shit. They don't talk about like, the actual meat and potatoes of the issues. Guys say the US is in so much trouble, and I've seen guys be like, oh, BRICS is just going to take them out tomorrow. The US owns all of the financial infrastructure, like everything that matters, the SWIFT system, like it's all US run. Like the very concept that the other guys are just going to get a system up, it's going to take fucking decades or more. Like they're so far behind. You know, the US controls all of the shit that matters. They control the CME. They control all the futures markets. Guys will turn around and be like, the US dollar is going to collapse to against gold, but they own the CME, the largest futures exchange for metals. Like, do you really think that they're just going to sit there and let that happen? Or will they just get funds to just short consistently into, like at odd times like they do, you know, just before when there's the least amount of trading, like spread, and then they dump the price and things like that. Like there's a lot of shit that they can do with paper contracts. So the very concept, like it's like anything, right? The futures market is everything. Like that's the shit that matters. You know, he who can predict the future, who can set the price in the future, doesn't care about what the price is of today. Like it's pretty obvious. It's all paper contracts. It's all just trust based. It doesn't have to exist. Like on a futures market, it doesn't have to exist. They can trade millions of tons of silver that doesn't even exist. They can sell it onto the market. It's not physical. It's not physically backed. So that's the very issue that gold and silver has. I think eventually, obviously, it will rise over time. But the very concept that you're just going to wake up one day and gold's going to be 10K an ounce, like that will never happen. Like that just would never happen. Like it would break the whole financial service to think that there's so many like checks in place to make sure that never happens. You know, so a lot of guys are fucking retarded. Like they're watching too much Peter Schiff, who again is just a theorist. Nothing he's ever said has made anyone money. He's been calling for Bitcoin at $10 that it's worthless. He's been talking about tech's a scam, Tesla's a scam at like, you know, when it was $100 or less. Before the multiple like buy splits, you know, before they split a zillion times. So you probably lost like 100x gains listening to that Spurg. You know, talking about gold and silver is the best play and all this shit. And guys will quote that retard from Rich Dad, Poor Dad, whose whole book was identified as a LARP. Like there was no rich dad, there was no poor dad. Like it's already well documented. He's just a book salesman. He just talks. He's another fucking talker. Like yes, he's smart for buying real estate, specifically buying residential. I agree with that. But a lot of the shit he says about gold and silver and Bitcoin, he doesn't know fuck all. Just another one stands there and sells books and tells you that the world is going to collapse. It scares people. Doesn't know shit about fucking investing. So you got rich selling books and then investing in real estate. Like that's not difficult. If you're making that sort of a cash flow from selling books, you can buy real estate. It's not complex. But here's another fucking Spurg. So that's my take on the financial markets and, you know, the structure of things and why the dollar is for the considerable future going to be the big dog. Because any controversy or anything happens, like, you know, like the world sneezes and everyone runs to the dollar. Like, did we not see what happened during COVID? Everyone runs to the fucking dollar because the US, they figure, is going to be the strongest powerhouse. If there's a world war, the dollar will fucking moon. Like, people don't understand fuck all. They know that if the world war hits, the US has the biggest nuts on the table. Like they're more likely to stick around than other countries. They have all of the like the easiest on ramps and off ramps and shit. Like if the US, if there's a war, like a world war, and the US system, like they're going to mop up a lot of the liquidity. Like that market is going to be what people predominantly invest in. Even if the US got hit by a nuke tomorrow, people think that the stock market would crash like fucking 99%. As though the companies in that have zero value, when a lot of the companies aren't even based at it. A lot of the companies itself can run online, and the infrastructure in that can still continue. You know, it would take the country would have to be put into fucking disrepair to be like the value to not be still there. You know, they control a lot of the infrastructure, the on-ramps, off-ramps. It's the easiest thing. Like how many fucking people do you meet where they're telling you that they hold like, you know, I don't know, like yen or yarn or some shit like that, like any of that crap, or rubles or shit. Like a lot of Spurgs think that Russia is like some financial powerhouse. They're not. Like it's pretty obvious. Guys think the Russian market is investable when they had the war and a lot of stocks dumped like 99% and people couldn't even sell. And a lot of people still couldn't even sell. You know, so a lot of people are retarded. Like that, a lot of people only hold ruble and yuan and things like that because they can't get out of those fucking currencies. Like, do you really think that if you went around Russia and said, would you rather hold dollar or ruble, that the people would rather hold rubles? And most won't. They'd rather hold dollars. but they can't hold fucking dollars in their bank. Like dumbasses don't realize that. They just can't exit into that currency. Like it's not a fucking option. You can't just walk in with it and be like, yep, I want to dump these rubles for $1 million US in Moscow. You can't just do that shit. Like people don't know fuck all. Like capital flight exists in those countries, so they're forced to hold that currency. They wouldn't like to, ideally, if they didn't have to. So of course, the stuff that people don't really understand. The US is the big dog. It's the tech big dog. It's leading us into a tech fucking future, whether you like it or not. They're the kings of innovation. Capitalism works for innovation. Capitalism works for centralizing control of fucking everything. Like, so obviously it's the best system for everyone, like for the government and everyone. But capitalism is still one way that you can get rich as the average, like, pleb shit kicker. It's still a way that you can get into somewhat of a free market. There are no free markets in the world. I know a lot of plebs have been convinced to think like other countries, because they hate America so bad, they think other countries are so much better, but most are much more corrupt, like specifically in the financial markets. A lot of the socialism or other structures, it only works for most then, like pretty much everyone then has fuck all, and only a few rape everyone. A few just get enriched completely and the rest get completely fucked. So it's better to be able to be a king, like, become something important, than it is to always know that you're a pawn or a peasant forever. So that's the part of being free. Like people don't realize a lot of that shit is this, they're not free anymore. Like you're waking up, it's like a soulless existence. Like your life is already decided for you. There's no chance. So a lot of those spurgs should move off to like North Korea or somewhere, but they won't. They'll just sit there and say how bad it is where they are. Like specifically if they're in the West, they'll bitch about the West. But then if they were outside the West, they wouldn't live for fucking like 1 year, they'd be dead. Like most of the life over there, you have to fucking perform, like you have to work. You can't say a lot of shit. Like you can't run around and talk about the government if you're in North Korea, or you'd be fucking murdered. So of course they don't really understand jack shit. And that's a good lesson for people to be more, like grateful for their fucking existence and understand that capitalism itself, I don't agree with all of it. And ultimately it ends where, like the monopoly board, a few people own everything. Like that's pretty obvious with where everything's going. And the rest are just plebs, like cogs in the wheel. But a few can still become successful in different niches as different innovations and things happen. Some people can ride it to success, others won't. But then in the other side of the spectrum, it doesn't matter what happens because it'll all be centralized by the government. You don't control shit and you'll never be anything. So, it's better to be able to put chips on the roulette wheel than it is for the same number to come up in roulette for every day for the rest of your life. All right, lads. Till next time.